All right, welcome everybody to this remote interview. My name is Lisette, and I'm interviewing people and companies doing great things remotely. And today on the line, I have David Horowitz, CEO of Retrium. I have Esther Derby, writer, speaker, coach, advisor, author, many, many things. And also another woman of many, many things, Diana Larsen. And Diana, I loved your description of the roving leadership agility advisor. I loved the roving. Yeah, I loved it. So
Yeah.
thank you all for being here. We're here today to talk about the second edition of the book, Agile Retrospectives, which depending on when you're hearing this podcast has already come out or is just about to come out. But I want to start this with the first question, and I'm going to throw it to you, David, and that is, what does a good remote Agile retrospective look like?
Oh, what a great question. I think this is something we have all been wondering about over the past 4+ years, given COVID, and for many of us beyond that. My answer might surprise some people, but what makes a effective remote retrospective is largely the same as what makes an effective in-person retrospective. The fundamentals are the same. And the fundamentals, you can think of them in kind of three categories, I suppose. One is what happens before the retro. One is what happens during the retro, and the last is what happens after the retro is done. So as the facilitator, before the retrospective, there's planning that has to go into making the retrospective as effective as possible. Things like, do you want to pick a focus, a narrow focus for the retrospective? And if so, share it with the team. Do you want to plan for what facilitation techniques you might be using, which activities, based on the team's context, based on the focus that you've picked? Once you're in the retrospective itself, we outline 5 phases to an effective retro in the book, which if you've read the first edition, you're already familiar with, but they are set the stage, bring people together, get them ready for the heart of the conversation, gather data, which is let's bring data, actual data to the conversation to ground all of us and have a shared mental model. There's generate insights, which is based on the data we're looking at. What can we learn? There is decide what to do, which is based on the insights that we have discovered, what are we going to do about it? And then there's close the retro, which is just bringing everyone back together to bring a close, to tie it with a bow, with a ribbon at the end. And that's during the retrospective. But then there's also after the retrospective, which is important too, which is now that we've learned something in the retro, well, what are we going to do about it? And how can we ensure that we actually have follow through on whatever it is we want to try to accomplish? So a good retrospective has all of those components tied together, and whether you're in person or remote, you need all of them to be effective. So with all of that as kind of the heart of what makes an effective retro, then we can start talking about, well, okay, now that you're remote, what are the additive things you need to be concerned about? I can throw out a couple things there, and then maybe Esther and Diana, if you want to share some thoughts as well. One of the challenges of remote retrospectives is that it's easy, as I think many of us know, to get distracted from whatever the flow of the conversation is. So it's really critically important to increase clarity of what is being discussed, by whom and when. And that leads to the importance of sharing an agenda ahead of time before the retrospective starts, and making sure that there are opportunities for people who aren't on the same page. I got a little lost in the thread, to bring you back into the thread of the conversation. I'll throw out one more idea about remote retrospectives, which is that physical space doesn't exist in remote teams. So for me, Lisette, you're over here, Esther, you're here, and Diana, you're this way. And that may or may not be the same for the three of you. When we're in person, it's easy to use relative spacing to have conversations. The sticky note to the left of that one, for example. And when you're online, it's much more complicated to do that. So finding ways to represent physical space online really, really matters.
I'd add that one of the things that happens during the retrospective that is likely to make it more effective is to have relatively equal participation. Just like in a face-to-face retrospective, if only a couple people are talking, it's not likely to be an effective retrospective, right? There's lots of research that shows that that's actually one of the factors about effective teams, is there's relatively equal participation, not totally equal, but relatively. And so that's a challenge that you have to face in person or remote. I think there are some additional challenges in remote because it's, the whole we figure out the talking over stuff when we're in person very easily. It's harder in remote space.
It's
Right.
unnatural in remote space. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And whose job is it to ensure the equal participation? Is that on the facilitator? Is that part of that role?
It is part of that role. Yeah, that's true. But it's not only the facilitator's role. There's David talked about what do you do before the retrospective, and a lot of what's going on there is how is the team already interacting? Are they treating each other with caring and respect? Are they really looking to make the best possible working relationships? If they're not, there's maybe some coaching that needs to be happening beforehand about how we will behave when we are together, or some working agreements, or there's a number of different ways to handle that. But that's an important piece. And then you can have agreements in the retrospective about how do we share airtime and so on. And I think another thing is it depends on how long a period of time you're looking at in the retrospective. If you're doing, if you're looking at a 2-week sprint or something equivalent to that, which is a relatively long period of time for people to remember what happened and so on, which is why the data is so important. That means you're going to probably have a longer retrospective because it's going to take a little more time to really get to the place where everybody's thinking about the same data in the same way. And then you have the conversations about generating insights and understanding what it means for you and so on. And so I think another thing to remember about remote retrospectives is it's tiring in a different way than when people are in the same room together. It's harder to just get up and go and walk out the kinks and go get yourself a cup of coffee than it is if you're all in the same room, right? And so building in that time for making sure that there are maybe more frequent breaks than you would expect to have otherwise, or some kind of activities that help people kind of be in the space in a different way, using their bodies or something to kind of refresh them, because then everybody's brains work better, right? So there's some really interesting things like that about remote retrospectives.
A couple things I want to build on there is it is everybody's responsibility to make sure there's relatively equal participation. You can do that with ground rules, working agreements that everyone is responsible for. But another part of it is having people like build some self-awareness, which is part of growing up, and becoming mature and maturing in your career is, developing some self-awareness about, oh, I do tend to go on a bit, so let me manage myself. Or, yeah, I have something I could add, but it's already been said by 2 people, so I don't need to like pile on. So there's also that piece of developing personal awareness, which will help effectiveness in any team. And then I want to clarify just a tiny bit, something Diana said. She said, we want the same data and we want to be thinking about it in the same way. We want the same data. We want divergence of opinion, but yes. And then to be able to converge on something together, but we need that divergence of thinking before that. And I'm sure that was, that's not what you intended to say. We have to be in groupthink.
No, you want the same reality, I'm assuming.
Right,
yeah. Right. You want the same vision of reality from which to build off of. Like the data tells us like, this is what is. And then now let's
and part of that.
Yeah.
Sorry, Esther.
I'm not saying that to pick on you. I just wanted to make
sure.
Sure
yeah. But part of that gathering data is bringing the data in and then discovering what are all the different perspectives on this data. That's the shared picture I'm talking about. So, yeah, absolutely.
David, where do most teams, what are the common mistakes? Where do most people go wrong?
In the retrospective itself?
Yeah, is it that they're not doing them often enough or even at all, or it's the same one every time, or where?
So one of the biggest mistakes, and there's a whole number, I could give an hour-long talk just about these mistakes, which is,
I bet.
And also there's a reason we're writing the book. So one of the biggest ones that I see is people come to the retrospective and they have every good intention of having a good conversation, and maybe they even do have a good conversation. But when the retrospective is over, everyone goes back and starts to focus on, I'll put this in air quotes if you can't see me, on the real work, right?
Mm.
Real work being the code you have to write. I'm putting this in quotes because the point I'm trying to make here is that the real work includes the retrospective work itself, that the learning that you're doing is real work. And it's important after the retrospective is over to make sure that you have a plan to catalyze the improvement that you're after, right? If you have an action item that you've come up with, it's not enough to just say we're going to work on X. You have to actually work on X. And it may or may not lead to the outcome that you intended. And that's okay. If it doesn't lead to the outcome that you wanted, then you've just reduced the solution set by 1, and you can try again if it's still relevant. But making sure that you're prioritizing the outcome of the retro has a very important impact beyond just whatever it is you're trying to accomplish. It also reinforces the importance of the retrospective itself. Because if you are running the retro and then it's not leading to change because you're not focusing on the actual change itself, people start to build a little bit of a resistance to the idea. Why are we doing this? It seems like a waste of time, right? But the importance, therefore, of actually working on the things you say you're going to work on is not just improving the thing, but also making sure that people understand that, hey, this is a critical part of the work that we're doing. So I'd start there.
I love that. The retro is part of the real work, part of the, oh, I love that. Esther, Diana, anything to add to that? Any common mistakes you see?
I see a lot of people slapping up 3 columns and a bunch of sticky notes and dot voting and then calling that a retro. Which, I mean, you can do that and have an effective retro, but it takes a lot of facilitation of a good conversation. And what I often see happen is like what we did well, what we should do differently. And there's the same thing in each column, and people don't discuss why they're seen differently, or people just kind of dot vote and without having any significant conversation on, well, what actually happened and what issues were involved in that, and how do we perceive it? And, so they come up with very superficial insights, if you can call them that. I don't know if you can actually say, dot voting on what we did well and what we should do differently. It generates insights. And then there's, oh, we'll fix that. And without any deep understanding of the issue. Or of why something worked, right? So that's, I see that a lot, and I think it's why often people think retrospectives are not worth the time, because that isn't worth the time.
Right. Yeah. Then you would rather be doing real work at that point, because right, indeed.
Work isn't
Indeed. So Diana, I'm going to just throw this to you. I don't know if it's the right person to answer this, but in terms of like the first edition of the book that you and Esther wrote, the first edition of the book, why did you write that edition? Let's start with that before we get into the second edition with the 3 of you.
Well, we were part of a group of people who were having a conversation about how continuous improvement was happening, and the 12th principle: at regular intervals, the team pauses to inspect, tune, and adjust, or whatever. But there was no instruction on that. The only thing that was really out there at that time was Norm Kurth's book about doing retrospectives at the end of very long, very huge projects. And so we were in a group of folks who were having that conversation, and people had started talking about heartbeat retrospectives that might happen at the end of every sprint or iteration. And somebody in the group said, somebody should write a book about this. And all heads turned to where Esther and I were sitting together. And we sort of looked at each other and said, okay. And that, then the next time we got together, we got busy on it. So it was really something that was generated out of the community saying, well, yeah, continuous improvement is clearly needs to be a part of this, but there's no we have no practices around it. We have no real instruction around how to do it. And what Esther and I were aware of, because we both had backgrounds that included things like meeting facilitation and the importance of that,
Mhm.
we understood that on most software development teams, there were not going to be people already on the team who understood how to facilitate a meeting well.
Mhm.
And so we wanted to make sure that at least some hints about that got included in how to make this happen, because, and that actually is one of the things that's changed. There now, meeting facilitation skills are just widely expected, as that a scrum master is going to do it, or the tech lead's going to do it, or the product owner's going, somebody's going to do it, right? Because we know those skills are needed in teams, but that wasn't true in 2004, 5, and 6 when we were writing the book and it came out. So that was a big part of the motivation as well.
Just as a little aside, I got my my introduction to facilitating was actually leading technical reviews back when I was programming. So it's another sort of meeting that, if the dynamics are off, it's going to be a horrible experience. So you kind of have to manage the interactions. You have to manage the outcome that you're looking for. You have to have some ground rules about how people are going to treat each other and how they're going to actually perform the review if you want to improve the quality of the code and the general quality of the coding. So that's actually where I got my introduction to facilitation, and then I expanded it in other directions. And doing retrospectives was a natural fit for me. I had done many long retrospectives for long projects, and so this was just an adaptation to a smaller frame.
It is amazing how far we've come in terms of expectations for meeting facilitation skills, especially after COVID, when everybody went online and it was dire. Like it was, we had to improve where we were suffering so much. It's just that, but even now, it's not, there's so many bad meetings, but that's
So many.
so many. Let's focus on the retrospectives. We can't solve all of them, but we can focus on the retrospectives. David, now the update is out. Why did the three of you decide to get together for this update, and why this update?
Yeah, well, a lot has changed in the past, 15 years since the first book came out, plus or minus. We're talking about remote, so remote is certainly much more common now, and the new book has a chapter all about remote retrospectives, and interwoven to the rest of the book are tips and tricks there as well. So that's one big change. Another thing that's changed is the three of us, that we've learned and we've adapted over the past 15 years too. And so when you look back at the first edition, I don't want to speak for the two of you, Esther and Diana, but I know from talking with you about it, that there are things that looking back you would change or modify. And so we thought, okay, a second edition might make sense to provide our updated guidance based on what we all have learned over the past 15 years. There's some activities in the book that weren't in the first edition, and some activities in the book that we removed from the first edition. So there seemed like an opportunity to ensure that the new generation of Scrum Masters and developers and other people involved in these teams can learn from the three of us.
Yeah,
I love it. Go ahead, Esther.
I think, David, that you called me first about it. And I was like, oh, well, and I opened the book, which I don't look at in detail every day. I hadn't looked at it for a while. I opened and I said, yes. It's like there were just some things about it that really needed to be refreshed. And the whole thing about the whole level of facilitation skills had improved in general. So kind of the tone of the book needed to come up in terms of that.
Right. I can imagine you'd want to go more in depth on some of the things that seem basic now, but were not basic 15 years ago.
Right.
And what about tools? Is there a section in the book about tools or recommendations, or is there a general feeling of tool agnosticism? How do you feel about the retrospective tools?
Don't be ruled by your tool.
The great rule.
Yeah.
So we were intentional in talking about kind of classes of tools and how to use things and when to use them and how to think about adapting them rather than making specific recommendations. Partly because one of our co-authors happens to be the CEO of a company that makes a retrospective tool. And you know, I think there's a line to walk there. Right.
Sure. On the one hand, it's a lot of expertise because you have
Right.
you have dived deeply into retrospectives in all its forms. And on the other
Right.
hand, you don't want to be a reseller marketing.
Right.
That was not the point, I'm assuming.
Right.
Yeah.
That was not the point. So we're more, our guidance is more about how to think about tools, how to think about what aspects of the retrospective will be aided by a tool. And, you know, when you just need a Zoom meeting, right?
Right.
So
When is the tool distracting and not effective
Right.
anymore?
Right.
I can give a specific example that we talk about in the book that I think is kind of shows what Esther's talking about a bit more concretely. So example here is, suppose you're running a retrospective and you have to pick a tool for the retro. Broadly speaking, there are two categories of tools that you could go to. There are the online whiteboard type tools, the Miros, the Murals of the world, that allow for general purpose collaboration, not just retrospectives, just an online whiteboard. And for a certain class of facilitator, that is your ideal environment because you can design your experience to your heart's content. And for a certain class of participant, that's the ideal environment. This is the type of person who already is familiar with that type of tool and knows how to move around that type of environment with ease. Most people don't fit into that bucket who are facilitating retrospectives. Most people are, Scrum Masters. They're doing many, many, many other things besides facilitating retros, and they don't have days to spend to design their own experience in a open-ended whiteboard. And so if that's the frame of mind you're coming from, it might make sense to pick a purpose-built tool that is designed around the context that you are trying to facilitate. So again, don't let the tool rule. Let your facilitation that you want to use help you pick out the right tool, but pick one purpose-built for what you're trying to accomplish. And it's that general guidance of which camp are you in that we want you to understand, as opposed to here is the specific tool we want you to use. We don't go into that level in the book.
I can imagine, because it's not a great answer. That's not, it's not what people want. There is no specific tool that is great for every single situation. So
plus they are changing all the time. So it would be out of date the day it was published.
Right. As I found out from my book with the whole tools section, I tried to tell them, but okay, that's something got out of your hand. I let it go. All right. Diana, a question for you is, with the ever evolving sort of role of work, how do you see the role of Agile retrospectives changing, or has it? Is it still the same, or is something changed because of the pandemic or the way that we're working now?
I think some things have changed. And for instance, one of the things I've been talking about a lot lately is very, very short retrospectives to kind of meet the need of people who are perhaps cutting back on the number of times that they spend in special purpose meetings because they are building their whatever they're building in an ensemble. So everybody there is mostly pretty much aware of all the things going on all the time. And so a daily stand-up becomes less important, for instance, because they're in constant communication. They don't need that extra, let's make sure we're all communicating meeting, right? And so I've been talking to a lot of people who are working like that, and some of them, a number of them, are doing a tiny, tiny retrospective at the end of every Pomodoro and getting a lot of benefit out of doing that. So, I think the range, and we are much more encouraging organizations to think about, where is your release retrospective? Where is the last retrospective you're going to hold when you're sunsetting a version? Where are those happening? And so I think where the original retrospectives book, Agile Retrospectives book, was mostly about, a week or 2 weeks or at most a month of work, and we're going to do a retrospective on that. I think the time span has really changed, and the nature of a lot of how teams work together has changed. There's still a lot of folks who they come into work, they maybe stand in front of their whiteboard or whatever, but individuals pick what part of the product they're going to work on. Maybe pairs are picking part of the work. In other instances, the whole team is going to be working on it if they're in that kind of an ensemble space. So there's much more variability about the structure of teams and the way they're approaching their work. And retrospectives are still important in all of those contexts. And so, and I think the idea of how the world has gotten faster. We talk now about the VUCA world, right? Volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. That's much more present for us now, and which means things are changing more rapidly. And we need to be able to learn better in response. We need to be able to learn as a group. And so the emphasis on retrospectives coming out with a single continuous improvement activity is still there, but it's as important is what is the learning that we are acquiring as we get there. And that's what I believe fosters resilience in teams, is the ability to see the unexpected and then respond with an inquiry about it. And so there are a number of those kinds of things I believe that have changed and that are changing the way we think about retrospectives, but in a good way. I don't think we're talking about throwing any babies out with bathwater, but we are expanding the idea of what is the contribution that retrospectives can make to whole team learning and organizational learning.
Not just for Agile, right?
And it's, yes.
If you aren't doing Agile in any way, shape, or form, and you can still benefit from retrospectives.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. And one question that comes up though is capturing all the information from the retrospectives and having a path where people can look back at the learning journey that the team went through. What are some of the guidelines for doing that? What advice do you have what advice is there out there for that for the follow-up, the capturing sort of the big picture over time view? I don't know who to throw that to. David. Yeah. or Diana, whoever wants to.
Yeah.
So I would first want to know what is there value to the team in capturing that learning journey? And if there is, then that's great. Let's come up with a way to make that effective. But my warning bells were going off a little as you were speaking, because sometimes documenting things actually is having the opposite impact of what you want. It's distracting the team from what really needs to be done, which is just seeing what's going on in the world around you, learning from it and responding to it. So I would start by just questioning it in the first place. If it is determined that the team does want to document their learning journey to understand what's going on, then certainly you can use whatever tool that you have on your team to do that, whether it's a Confluence type of environment or just a normal wiki. But to me, the most important thing is that we're running these regular retrospectives, inspecting what's going on and learning from them, as opposed to looking back to document our journey.
Yeah, I think this question gets into the whole explicit versus tacit knowledge. And explicit knowledge is the stuff that's easy to write down. It's this, the kind of observable external stuff, which is what people often focus on in, knowledge management and so forth. But the stuff that actually helps teams perform better is implicit knowledge. It's the stuff that, we don't necessarily know what we know until we need it, and we you know, it's becomes part of just the way we think about things, and that can exist on an individual level and a team level. Super hard to capture, right? Super hard to capture. And that's the stuff that almost always makes the most difference.
And there's
So
a little
it's
danger,
transmitted socially.
right? And there's a little bit of danger in writing down that sort of thing, in that who gets to see it. It could
Totally.
easily, yeah.
It can be
It-
used for evil so quickly.
Yes, yes. In the hands of I've been diving into lately an academic theory base that's out there now called self-determination theory, which talks about group autonomy and, you know, what are the factors involved in that. And one stream of that is about leadership. How do you lead in that kind of an environment? And Agile is definitely, you know, we talk about self-organizing teams, we talk about team autonomy. We're definitely in that camp. And one of the streams of research in that theory base has to do with leadership. And there have been lots and lots and lots of studies done now that what they call controlling dominant leaders, controlling dominant motivation leaders, actually suppress team performance. Whereas something that they call autonomy supportive leaders tend to amplify team performance. But it's because it would be the nature of a controlling dominant leader to want to know what happened in every retrospective.
Right.
And so for me, that's why the bells were going off. It's like that plays into a kind of leadership that maybe it's not going to be healthy. So there would have to be a lot of agreements about who is this documentation for? Is it only for the use of the team to be able to track their learning journey and to gain some insights from that? Or is it going to go beyond the team and be in the hands of someone else? And yeah.
I think it's really fun when teams look back over a period of time and just say, what have we learned? What do we know now that we didn't know? You know, when we started working on this product or when we started working together. I think in some ways that's a very fun way to look at what have we learned. And it brings it to people's awareness so that they can begin to articulate it more. They can begin to appreciate it more. They can be more conscious in applying it. But it's still something that, you know, it's not necessarily easy to transmit to other people. You know, there's this difference between insight problems and move problems. And, you know, once you have the insight, it becomes a move problem. But if you haven't had that insight, and sometimes you have to have it on your own, right? So, but I think it can be fun for teams to look back at what we learned.
I can give one more example about this that I'm taking from the book too, which is if you're a team working in a larger organization or a larger context, sometimes you come across problems that you can't solve on your own, right? You need the organizational support to be able to overcome whatever it is that you're facing. Now, a lot of times teams assume that's the case, and actually there is something that you can do, and that's a different story entirely. But there are cases where actually you need the support of the organization around you. So there's something called a retrospective radiator, which is a specific case of an information radiator. It's just something that you're putting out there for the universe so that you can share whatever it is you want to share as broadly as you possibly can. And a retrospective radiator is the instance of that that's specific to a retro. So in a retrospective, if a team comes across an issue that they decide they can't solve on their own somehow, one option that they have is voluntarily, because they choose to do this, because they are opting in to avoid the problem Diana was talking about with the controlling leader, they can post whatever that is onto their radiator, hang it outside their team room. If you're in person, if you're a distributed remote team, come up with whatever the system everyone looks at every day, you know, maybe it's Slack somewhere else, and just share it. So this is, hey, we are struggling with X, and you just want to share that with the world. And maybe someone else sees that and they can say, well, you know what, we actually came across a potential solution, let me help. Or maybe you have learned something in your retrospective that you think others in the organization might benefit from. Rather than keeping that private to the team, if the team opts in, that's the big if they opt in, they can choose to share that on their radiator with the rest of the organization. And that can really help document the journey, but not for the sake of documentation. It's for the sake of organizational learning.
Right. It's working out loud and letting people know what's happening, what you find important that's happening. I love that. It really reminds me of, I had the great honor of doing an interview with an astronaut last year. And because I was curious, like what happens when you're collaborating from space? Like how does remote collaboration change? Like when you're like on the other planet, like that, but what he said is that astronauts train to have the right information at the right place at the right time. And they train together so much that they no longer need verbal communication. They can know, like you have with your partner, I know at a glance that it's my husband from a mile away, just by the way that he walks. And so, astronauts train that way for on their team, that they don't need those verbal communications. And in a way, retrospectives are sort of that glue, that training of how to be together, how to work together, how to improve together in that way. It's sort of the same sort of concept in that.
Yeah, Lisette, it was an interesting experience that I had not very long after the book came out. I was at a reception somewhere, and a young man came up to me and he said he had been in a workshop that Esther and I had done in a conference about retrospectives, and he had come back and he was telling me how he had shared that with other people in his team, and they had started doing retrospectives. And he says, I've learned the secret. And I said, what? I didn't know that Esther and I were keeping any secrets. I said, well, what's the secret? He said, when you get good at doing your retrospective, all your other meetings get better too.
Ooh.
And that was an interesting insight from him, that if you're learning to have good behaviors and collaborate and so on in the retrospective, that doesn't just get in that retrospective box. That is then skills that people have that they can spread. And
technical review skills helped with every other meeting.
that's right.
Indeed. Yeah. And indeed, the retro is in fact also a radiator of its own kind.
Yeah.
That's what I'm having all kinds of visuals here. I'm going to have a lot of fun with the graphics for this episode, I'm sure. All right. Well, we're reaching the end of our time, and man, I could go on and on. I have pages and pages of notes here, but I'd like to maybe just end by asking each of you, what's one of the top takeaways from this second edition that you would want people to know or to leave with? I'll try to give a few seconds to have something come to mind. I know there's a lot. Any volunteers to start? Diana, it looks like you're ready.
Yeah, I would say that one of the things I would like people to take away from a retrospective is, if you're holding a meeting and you've called it a retrospective and you're walking away with having only made lists and come to no agreements about what comes next for your team, that you're not really getting the benefit of a retrospective. And that there are ways to ensure that you do get the benefit from a retrospective, and I hope we've provided some guidance for that.
You're stealing my thunder, Diana. I was going to say roughly the same thing, that I get on my soapbox here, but it isn't enough to say make it so, which is a reference back to the first edition, if you're familiar with it. There's actually things that you have to do to try to make it so. And it's really, really important to me that people hopefully can learn something from the book and put it into practice that helps encourage the actual change after the retro is over.
I love that you said that. I'm deep into watching Star Trek right now with Captain Picard. And so I just saw Make It So coming.
And
all right.
I'd say that the art of a retrospective is the art of helping the group think, learn, and decide together. And that if you can do that in a retrospective, you can do it in any kind of meeting. Help people think, learn, and decide together.
I love that. I'm writing it down furiously. I love that. I want to thank you all for your time today and for spending it here with me and talking about the second edition of the book, Agile Retrospectives, coming out. We'll have all the information for people in the show notes. Thank you all so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Lisette.
Thank you for
Thank you.
inviting us.
All right, everybody, until next time, be powerful.